And we're live. All right, welcome to Docker Tuesday 2. So this is a second episode of our little experiment. We're going to go over design proposals with a group of maintainers and try and reach a decision, or at least move things forward. So last time we kind of did a mixed bag of the oldest patches, all the design proposals, starting with whatever was oldest to get our algorithmic metric down. Algorithmic meaning age of least recently updated. But this time we're going to do something a little different. We're going to pick one proposal and then drill in as much as possible. And then if we have time left, then we'll look at something else. So proposal of the day is clustering. Woohoo! So, we also have as guests the two main contributors, Andrea and Victor. Yay! Yay. So I need the fake applause button for next time. So what's the pull request number?
8859.
8859.
Knows it by heart.
8859. Yeah. Good. Okay. Good point. Good point. Knows his pull request number by heart.
Yeah.
All right. So so you guys saw the demo, right? And there's a long thread over here. So okay. So first, I need a volunteer to. Well, Amy, I know earlier you volunteered to take notes and at the very least document decisions and action items, so that would be cool. So you're good for that, okay? And I would also need a volunteer to, while we're talking, go through the thread and bring up the objections and questions of the thread, so we can address them. Because if we're all stuck reading the whole thread, then it's going to be a really boring thing to listen to. But yeah, so who volunteers for that? To represent people on the thread.
The thread being Dr. Dev.
The discussion thread, no, the discussion thread on the PR.
Oh, update it after the fact.
Yeah, they'll just, no, not that. Just reading what's there today and like summarizing the questions and concerns in there so we can talk about them out loud, basically. Just so we don't spend 30 minutes just all reading through it. And then I think that's it. So this is the most up to date, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we should, and this is a docs firsts proposal, right?
Yeah.
All right. So should we just browse the MD? Should we try and build?
I guess we can browse the MDs.
Okay. So okay, so there's in the index you add getting started with Docker cluster, and then there's a user guide page, and that's where all the docs live, right? Okay.
For now, it's been called clustering.
Does it so? Everything else is exactly the same. It doesn't change the syntax or UI or anything. No one can hear you.
Oh, no, it doesn't.
Okay.
Well,
So let's just view that file.
probably gonna be a couple of API additions, but
You should really come closer because if
yeah.
Usually we have. Last time we had Vincent Batts from Red Hat call in, and
Okay.
but
Can you come closer?
since Indra is in the Docker office and there's no more meeting rooms available. All right.
Victor, you want to contribute
Yeah.
as well? It's gonna be easier.
We could all just huddle up.
Like the lunch.
No, there may be a list who's here. So on the maintainer side, there is me, Solomon Hikes, Michael Crosby, Jesse Frizzell, and Arnaud Portery. And Amy is volunteering her project management, and actually, I guess you represent Docker Inc., right? Since there may be some dependencies, and you know best about them. And then Andrea and Victor are representing their patch. So I'm here. I'm going to paste links as I go in RC. Boom. right. Oh wait, there's a whole section. I'm in the wrong link actually.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I'm also a very poor GitHub navigator. Actually, next time I'll ask someone to navigate while I talk. My brain just can't do both at the same time clearly. Okay, cluster dynamic. This is what we want to see.
Yeah.
Solomon?
Yeah.
I started reading one of the very lengthy comments done by I Build the Cloud, who basically raises a more general concern about the direction that this proposal is going. And he basically arguing that Docker is trying to find a fine line between not integrating, not doing multi-host, and then doing more fragmentation on the third-party side for the user, or if it's integrating too much, then it basically it's not good for the third-party apps. And so he's advocating for a plugin system. He's linked the PR as well, and he basically would like to see less of what's going in this PR and more of primitives and plugins for discovery, for all those things. So that's all I wanted to say.
This is the comment.
The very lengthy comment at the end.
Summary. There's a comment by Bill Cloud saying maybe we should make this plugins. Correct?
Correct. And basically
we'll
providing primitives for host registration, host discovery, all these titles.
So we're talking about making clustering a plugin, or making a plugin out of things that clustering depends on, like discovery. Anyway, well, you know what? We'll dig into the owning plugins as a question. Like, how should this be a plugin? Should it be a plugin right away? Should it be a plugin later, etc.
Okay.
All right, let's walk through Docker. So getting started with Docker cluster. Who read this, by the way? So there's dash discovery, and I give a URL.
Correct.
Yeah.
Just one question. The dash discovery is really discovery? It's really a join the cluster? I'm just started reading, so.
Yes, so, well, you want probably to handle that?
So the discovery, the URL you pass to the flag, basically you just get a list of IPs from all the nodes in your cluster. It can be private IPs, so it just to discover the other nodes, but it doesn't go through this service each time there is communication. It's just the first time when you start the master, it will contact the discovery service and get the IPs of all the nodes.
Tibor, can you hear Victor?
I can hear Victor. I could not hear Andrea earlier.
Okay. Do we have another one of these mics? Can we spread them out? I think there's one on that table over there, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if
We're stealing all the mics.
So it's really bootstrapping the cluster.
Yeah, so to sum up, you could replace that by just giving the entire list of IP addresses in your cluster, and dash discovery just makes that easier because you don't have to like give the entire IP address of your cluster, but you could instead.
So when I run, I'm going to focus on UI.
Yeah.
We can talk about implementation later. So there's a new flag to the daemon mode, docker-g-discovery. I'm not going to read it with explanation of what it does. That tells me run the Docker daemon just as usual, no change, but now use this discovery service that I don't know what it does. So what does this first command do? Docker-g-discovery. What does it do?
It runs regular daemon and just registers itself into the discovery service, so it can be found by the cluster.
So effectively, this makes a potential cluster.
Correct.
Okay.
That's what I was asking. Maybe it's more a join than a.
Yeah, I think if it's the action of if this is what makes a daemon join a cluster as a slave, I think it should be called join or slave or something that says what it does,
I
right?
agree, but you could actually like have a regular daemon and just give the IP address to the master, and it will be part of the cluster because it doesn't actually need to join. It just the master needs to be aware that the node exists, and then it's part of the cluster automatically.
So that's might be in the future that to join a cluster, a slave needs to do more than that, right? Maybe
Yeah.
it needs to provide credentials or.
So how about something like dash clustering and then combined with discovery, so it makes it like explicit that it's going to clustering mode. Because dash join is not really joining a cluster, just really registering to the discovery service, and it would make sense eventually to have dash like clustering but without discovery.
Right, exactly. But so the opposite is not true, right? No one's ever going to use a discovery for something other than
Correct.
clustering.
Yeah.
Correct.
So my point is, instead of join, we could probably have a clustering flag and then like a discovery flag.
That are independent?
No, basically discovery requires clustering. So you actually explicitly say, okay, I'm going to clustering mode.
Okay, so a subcommand, Docker cluster.
I don't know if it should be a subcommand. No, it should be just a flag, I guess.
Let's edit this.
Just so as a context, the idea is that that's the kind of things you add to etc default Docker. So it shouldn't be a command because like it's supposed to.
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think I following the image model. I think we're going to go into pluggability. Like, can I use my own discovery without talking to the hub? Because I know that will be a big question, and the answer should be yes. You should be able to do this without talking to the hub. I know because you guys explained to me before that the reason it needs to call to the hub is really for convenience, because sometimes there's just no pre-existing way locally that the hosts could use to find each other. If multicast is supported, it could use zeroconf.
Correct.
And actually, let me take notes as I go.
Yeah.
So, is the plan to use zeroconf for discovery, if possible?
Eventually, yes. We went with, so right now we went with the discovery service because it's the, we figured that that would make like most people happy, but yeah, eventually we want to have like different backends and probably have a zero configuration backend so you can automatically start nodes.
So once that exists, what does the command look like? Is it dash discovery something else?
It could be dash discovery, zeroconf, column // and
Okay, so here's what I want. I want Docker cluster, and actually that would be ideal. Docker cluster, and it does something relevant by default.
Andrea had a point against the subcommand.
Which was
that you can want to put it into the etc defaults.
Yeah, that's how usually like we think people will bootstrap the clusters to just change etc default Docker, and that just assumes that you're gonna pass extra flags, not actually a command. Because we'll just assume that the server will boot up, start Docker with a few flags, and then you should join the cluster. You shouldn't like need to go to the machine and type stuff.
But I mean, the fact there's a dash at the beginning of the second word in argv doesn't make me need to type stuff, right? It's just a convention. You're saying having something that doesn't start with a dash in etc defaults feels wrong.
Correct.
I'm saying I don't think that's the most important part. Actually, we've talked about making Docker-D become Docker daemon for a while now. We've actually tried a few times. It's just that doing that without breaking some legacy behavior of the parser is hard. But if we can magically do it tomorrow, I would do it.
But right now, the behavior is that every Docker command that's like client-side, it basically breaks the convention we had forever, which is Docker something. It's a client command interpreted by the CLI.
Wait, what breaks what forever?
Oh no, it just breaks the convention that whenever you type Docker something, usually it's a CLI command interpreted by the CLI. It's not like a daemon. It could be the first one, but I'm just saying that it's brand new. Like it breaks the conventions we had in the past. Like currently, there's no.
Right. Let's separate these concerns.
Yeah.
Assuming I'm okay with breaking that convention. So for now we can just we can make up a flag like -- cluster.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Docker -- cluster, Docker cluster. Let's use them interchangeably. If we find that we are fine with using a top level command for the daemon, which we will, unless someone convinces me otherwise. Because Docker-D as do this, be the daemon, is incredibly weird.
Yes, but I could point you like to every single like Unix
But-
daemon out there. It's usually
but-
like a
but-
flag. There's
But
no.
let's discuss it later. Let's
Yeah.
talk about
Okay.
the fact that they're interchangeable. So now we have this thing, whether it's a flag or a subcommand, and it's mutually exclusive with -d.
Good question. Right now it's
Or not.
Right now
It
you
has to
must-
be a daemon, so it
Yeah.
has to work. Right now it's a daemon flag.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have to do docker-d --.
Okay. So really, what we're talking about is a sort of an alternative to -h, right? I'm doing Docker-D. I'm running Docker in daemon mode, and clustering is part of that, right? It's not a new top-level thing. It's within daemon, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So right now I have a daemon, and really all it's going to do is listen for remote API connections on one or more addresses, right? So today I might do Unix, var run docker sock, which by the way has a default, or TCP something, etc., etc. So my first instinct, and I'm playing kind of untrained user here, like what I expect without reading the docs, right? That's what I'm going for. It doesn't mean necessarily it's the right answer, but it's kind of what I as a user would try first. I would say, okay, I want the daemon, but I want it to join the cluster, so maybe it's -h something, like something that lets me join a cluster, right? So maybe this is where put the address of the discovery service, or we say 0conf, or it's an alternative to -h, like -- join cluster. And here I say, put a URL for discovery, right? And the URL could be, I guess, an HTTPS URL, or it could be, I don't know if there's a convention for 0conf groups, but something with 0conf. And what's missing there is it would be cool for the default to not have to type a URL or a name or anything. So something like Docker-D, again, -- cluster. Like there's a reasonable default that we can think of for that, right? It could be look for something on 0conf, which never hurts, right? And if you don't find anything, look for discovery endpoints on your hub account or something, like as a fallback. And in between the two, there could be any number of plugins at some point that add new discovery methods. But do I need to give an ID to the cluster or something?
Yes.
Yeah, probably you should. Just for.
You need to give a token.
Okay. Oh, okay. So maybe we're all right.
Even 0conf is rather like.
So maybe we're talking about this then. Hang on. Maybe we're talking about Docker-D -- join cluster right, and that's not a URL. It's not 0conf specific. It's not hub specific. It's a cluster ID, and maybe under the hood there is a number of backends that will try and find that ID using discovery mechanism foo, right?
Yeah.
And that way, in the beginning, we might ship with default backends, and the two obvious ones look like 0conf and hub. And what you guys are saying is for kind of an MVP, you prefer hub because it works everywhere.
Correct. Yeah.
And I mean, from my experience, it's true that EC2 and DigitalOcean, pretty much every cloud deployment out there doesn't have multicast out of the box. So I think everybody needs to. I think everyone's restoring to this kind of default discovery. I think etcd does the same thing, right? So.
Yeah, for starters, basically we can only have one discovery method for the first version, so we decided to go with that one. Like it could be only 0conf, but when we don't think it will work for most of the people out there.
Yeah. Okay. Step one. So you guys like this here? By the way, how do I create a cluster? That's master, right? That's after that. Well, your first example, I gave a URL.
Yeah.
And does that require the cluster to exist, or does it create the cluster?
No. we're going to change that.
Yeah, actually.
So
Okay, I'm just I'm erasing stuff as I go, keeping the latest version.
We've been, like, since the spec, we've been kind of reworking a little bit on the discovery service. And
so
yeah,
right now you need to create the cluster before starting any Docker.
yep.
Like for the MVP.
You create the cluster, you get a token, and you pass the same token to every node.
Say that again. Sorry, I was typing a comment.
So right now, at least for the MVP, you need to create the cluster before.
It always makes sense.
Okay. So you need to create a cluster.
So you as in the user.
Yeah.
So how do I create the cluster?
In the future, you will go to the hub and create the future. And
Create
right now,
the future.
Yeah, correct.
right now,
Okay.
basically, you Docker to URL, and it gives you the token.
Like etcd.
Like etcd. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. For the hub method.
When you say etcd does it, you mean etcd, the hosted discovery
Yeah,
service?
those tokens. Those,
Okay, so same idea.
Same idea. You.
But then it means the hub specific. Even if I use, so fact number one, definitely some Docker users will want to disable hub as the discovery mechanism, and we
Yeah.
want that, right? The idea is to be a convenience,
Yeah.
not mandatory.
Yeah.
But if they do, then if the UI for creating, if the flow for creating a cluster on hub is specific to the hub, that means if you disable the hub and use something else, then you have to learn a new flow specific to that something else, right? Wouldn't it be better if Docker defined the UI if you're creating a cluster, and then the whatever backend, quote unquote, makes the call to the hub if it's using the hub, to something else if you're using something else?
Well, it really depends on the backend, actually, because in zeroconf, I guess
You can choose your token. If you're on zeroconf on your local network, you can choose your token.
I don't even know if you choose your token. You just have a service popping up, and so well, I guess what we're saying is that the methods are very different. So I don't think we can find a common ground between all of them.
As a user, I want to create the cluster and I provide as input the ID. So couldn't the backends just implement a create cluster with method with an ID, and then it does what needs to be done? Because there's no other user input required, right?
Well, for instance, in zeroconf, you don't need to create the ID. You just pass an ID, and that's it. There's no creation. You just broadcast the ID, and then whatever nodes have the same ID, they just join each other. There's no creation.
Right, but how would the user do that? How would
you pass any ID you like?
But you mean in join cluster?
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's no creation. They just broadcast the same thing and then they join each other.
So I really think I think we should. I think from a user experience point of view, I think if we define a UI for joining a cluster, we should also define a UI for. We should define a flow for clustering end to end. If we define only part of the flow, then the rest of the flow will be fragmented for the user, right? It means now I have to think, I have this cool backend system I can join, and it uses whatever backends were configured by my sysadmin, except when I want to create a cluster, in which case I have to think, right? It also means as a user, maybe I don't have access, right? That one possibility at least is, let's say I work at a company and the company uses Hub, and they set up, these sysadmins set up all the Docker daemons to be connected to the hub and allow for joining clusters in an organization, whatever. I'm making this up. If it allows for joining, it probably should also allow for creating in the same flow, because maybe as the Docker user, I don't have the credentials for that org. I don't know. It's a hypothetical scenario because today credentials are the same end to end, but you can imagine that, right? And I know it's a request to do multi-tenancy and things like that.
Yeah.
I'm just picturing kind of the tutorial, Docker clustering tutorial. I want to avoid the first part being a giant else statement,
Yes. But still a bit fuzzy because so as you mentioned, for instance, there will be multi-tenancy eventually, and for instance, multicast won't work with that, or if you even have a data center with multiple rack switches, you can use multicast. So we're still trying to find a good way to have a non-hosted discovery service. Multicast might work in simple use cases when you have only a rack or so, but it won't scale like to more than a few rack switches because it's local to the switch and it's local to the data center and so on and so on. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is right now we don't have a good like non-process solution for discovery, and so it's hard to picture like a generic way to create clusters, and we don't know like what the other option will be in the future.
I mean, there's a lot of unknowns, but we can start with the UI because that's tangible, right? Well, so just to ask something, what if this were the UI and we just said join cluster, look for that cluster ID across the different backends you have configured, and if it doesn't exist, it will create it. What if that was the flow? Like when you join cluster, it's reentrant. It will join if it exists, otherwise it will create it.
So the problem is currently for the hub, the token is actually a security mechanism because if you say like join cluster foo, that means that anyone that does like join cluster foo will join your cluster.
Yeah.
And that's why like we force use the UID from the discovery service. It's not just because we want you to. It's so you pick like a sensible, unique cluster name. Because if there's a conflict, you end up joining someone else's cluster and get these containers and vice versa.
Okay, but you still allow people to enter the string that they want, right?
Yeah.
That's a feature.
Yeah.
So what if we did in that case to facilitate creating safe UIDs? What if I said, okay, docker-d join cluster with no arguments will generate an ID for me?
You have to pass the same ID to every single node.
Yeah.
So you would have to.
So in that case, I specify a string.
Yeah, but like we're talking for you will have like 50 nodes and so on. So okay, the first one, you don't have to, but you have to kind of copy the ID and pass it to every single node.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean is we'll facilitate probably the first node, but really the usual case, if you create the ID, you put it to your AMI or something, then you just spin up 50 instances. So even if it helps you like bring up the first machine, it's not something you're gonna do manually. Like probably you have like a fleet of machines, and I don't know if I'm making this up clear.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. That I see what you mean, but at the same time, my point stands that I don't want to learn something outside of Docker to create I Google Docker clustering. I find the doc for Docker clustering. You've got my attention. The clock is ticking. The first thing I need to do to follow the example is leave the Docker UI and choose a tool and use that for step one.
I just want to add a few points. So the problem is if you generate automatic NID and you just blindly follow the instructions and you have like let's say 3 nodes, what will happen is that you're gonna create 3 clusters of 1 node each. If you just copy and paste the command.
Yeah, no, I
it can be even worse. Like it's not working.
I agree. I agree, and then so the answer is not just to tell everyone to do -d and -- cluster and they generate an ID. But maybe there's a dynamic command we can add, right?
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
So if you're interested, but you have questions on IRC and people reacting to it,
Good
thinking that
point.
no one is.
Yeah. Thanks. It's actually hard to talk and read at the same time. All right. So, actually, do you want to own IRC and just ask the questions as the question number 1? We have a question from the audience.
We have remarks from Malt J, who say that perhaps every node.
Sorry.
Malt J, who say that every node should be able to act as a discovery service endpoint.
Hang on. Can these 2 microphones work at the same time?
Is there video?
There is screen sharing.
Oh, yeah.
So the question is, should all nodes access the discovery service?
Should all nodes be able to act as a discovery service?
Oh, act as a discovery service. Very good question.
Sorry, come again? I was distracted.
Well, I'll give an intuitive answer, and then I'll let these guys answer. So the question is, can every node act as a discovery service? So the key is that I expect that in this implementation, yes, every node acts as a kind of a member in basically a distributed state kind, whether it's a raft consensus or something else. But what we're talking about here is not that. It's how do you get to the point where node 1 talks to node 2, how they find each other. So if every node can be a discovery service, at some point you still need to bootstrap the task of running one manually, determining its IP and port, and giving that to others. And I know one motivation for Victor and Andrea was to kind of solve that bootstrap problem, making it a little more reentrant, because if when you get started, the first thing you have to do is copy paste IPs and port, that makes for a complicated setup, because then you have, as Andrea describes, you have init scripts somewhere with a hard-coded IP port, and then if your topology changes and that's not where your node is anymore, then you have a static configuration to change everywhere. At that point, you start thinking, oh, maybe I need to manage this with configuration management, and then you're screwed, because you're no longer in easy to get started territory. So the question is really, how do you have zero effort bootstrap? That's what zeroconf is for. And we would use it everywhere if it weren't for the small problem that in a lot of places it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, zeroconf only works for the very basic cases.
Is there another question?
Well, there were live reactions to the talks about joining the cluster, but no.
Yeah, I see that, for instance,
The problem is that we have a 1 minute delay apparently between YouTube and IRC.
Yeah, I know.
So, IRC, perhaps if you can just formulate questions that still are valid after 1 minute delay.
Well, I think it helps that we're talking about one big topic compared to last time where we would skip from patch to patch, and then by the time you hear about the patch, the maintainers are already looking at the next one. Yeah, so comment of Joe saying zeroconf would scare the crap out of anyone doing ops. That is absolutely true. The goal is not, so we're talking about two things here, right? In general, for all these features, what we're trying to do is make it easy to get started with the batteries included implementation that lets you kick the tires and play with it, and that's kind of the signature philosophy of Docker. And B, make it very, very pluggable so that you can actually remove all the stuff that you want to remove, put in different implementations. And ops people, you're right, ops people don't trust zeroconf, but there's another thing that they don't trust, and it's 99% of all the other ops people stuff out there. So ops people don't trust each other's stuff, right? And I know you guys at Google have not a lot of respect for a lot of ops tools that a lot of other ops people use, and vice versa. And ops is a very fragmented world. So as usual, we're going for hourglass. We're not saying everyone should use this implementation for everything. We are saying everyone should start with this default implementation because it will be good enough for 80% of people, especially when they're just kicking the tires, and then you should be able to change everything. So yes, 100% agree. We should not force zeroconf on ops people.
Yes.
What about the security issue about joining a random cluster?
So like if you type a token and then you're just joining the wrong cluster?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, I don't really have an answer to that. I think at some point it's kind of equivalent to like secret URLs, right? Like if the secret is long enough and random enough and people understand that it's a secret so they don't share it, then it's just a question of how, is there enough entropy in there?
I guess the point was to never ask the user to enter it manually, but always having to go through the generation, whether it's like a curl or whether it's built into the CLI or whatnot.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't just type like my cluster name into my little cluster as
Yeah.
a cluster name. You should always like use whatever we generate.
Yeah.
For you, because it's so dangerous to think that the ID is actually something like private to your user in some way. And
Well, what if
actually it's not?
What if so what? First, just to answer Joe's follow-up, Jubita and RC. You're right. I said you would use zeroconf everywhere. What I meant was in the default implementation, like what ships out of the box. If zeroconf solved everybody is out of, then we only use that out of the box. But because it doesn't, then for a complete out of the box experience, then it looks like you need, or more presumably, have an option out of the box for people who are allergic to using feeling locked into a particular service. So zeroconf would fit the bill nicely. And I think trying zeroconf by default and then falling back to hub seems like that's what I would want, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but still, we're this is in the scope of out of the box, like stuff that you should be able to remove for production. Okay, so there's security considerations around how to make sure that secret is really secret.
It's 256 bits currently, so it takes a while like to just randomly brute force it, and it's the same mechanism used by other projects such as etcd. So yeah, brute forcing will require like a lot of luck to end up like on the same idea.
Yeah. So so there's a general topic around the safety of that. I think it's fair to say we should make sure that token-based system is at least equivalent to other token-based systems out there. If that's the way etcd does it, then you guys should make sure you follow the same best practices. Brendan's saying it would be better if auth was required. I totally agree. The main point is there is a whole group of contributors currently adding a full auth infrastructure into Docker. Once there's auth and identity in Docker, then it'll be much easier for something like clustering to hook into it. At the same time, we should figure out there are useful clustering that could come out concurrently while identity is still being worked on.
My counter argument would be that the entropy of the token is actually higher than your typical login and password for your hub, because it's way longer than that. So it's easier to guess like a login and a password than it is to guess the token. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we can make a high level note that as soon as there's sharing outside the boundary of your trusted network, then there is a consideration of security. And I would say two things. If it's pluggable, which it should be, other services than the hub might try and offer discovery for this, and that should be possible. And so they'll have to deal with their own security concerns, and it'll be the user's responsibility, whether they to use a service that does good security. And separately, if we introduce a dependency in the hubs, at least for the out of the box, the way we did for registry, then just like for registry, it'll be the hub responsibility to make sure it's secure. So let's just say we take that for granted, that it will be secure, whatever it is that we launch. But obviously, as usual, before we release something, we should make sure it is.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of specific enough that we can go back to that later.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I just wanted to add. So,
Joe, just moving on from auth and security for now, definitely acknowledging that it's a high-level concern. The way identity and auth is being built into Docker is that each runtime has its own key pairs, it has its own identity, and the auth framework works at the granularity of the agent. So you can do things like authorize. You will be able to do things like authorize this Docker runtime to access this cluster, but not that one. You very much want that. Yeah. The actor is a machine, not a user. 100% agree. And by the way, if you guys want to join the effort to contribute that in. I'm sure that's an area that the trust people will be happy to get your help.
Just to conclude that, I wanted to add that one of the reasons right now it's that you pass the token and so on and so on. It's not actually a Docker login. It's because it's supposed to be an automated process. You just have the machine booting up, and it should join the cluster. You shouldn't like SSH into it and do a Docker login before proceeding. My second argument is that we will also support like Docker supports TLS config, so that will be like when your nodes are master. So your like no, if you set it up correctly, no one else should be able to talk to your nodes, and vice versa. So your master, if it tries to talk to a node that is not part of your cluster, TLS config will just fail, and that's already built into Docker. We're not adding something new. You just specify your certificates, and it will just work out of the box. What I'm saying is, if your Docker nodes are already reachable on the internet, like with a public IP, and everyone can talk to them, then you already have a problem. Like that shouldn't be that way. And yeah, the discovery
that's a good point.
Makes it easier to access those, but if they're like publicly available, then you have a problem. It shouldn't be that way.
So that's a good point. I'll just after this, let's move on from security. Not while acknowledging it's a very important topic. There are two layers here, right? First, you need that discovery service to be safe and completely secure. And the second layer is what we're talking about protecting is not live access to Docker daemons, but access to their IP and port, which presumably is either not reachable from the public internet or has a layer of auth in front of it. Otherwise, like you said, you got a problem. So, okay. All right, so let's go back to the UI because we haven't resolved the UI problem of kind of having a reentrant way to both create clusters and join clusters. I would still prefer to have a way to create clusters without going through the UI of a separate tool. It's not mutually exclusive, by the way. Like, of course, if I go through a hub, one cool way would be for the hub to show like clusters I created and let me create one. But it would be cool if I could do that without leaving kind of the native upstream Docker experience, right? Especially out of the box.
Like cluster create, cluster leave, cluster delete.
Yeah, I agree. So, but in my opinion, it's client commands, because you should create the cluster before starting your first node. So you could just grab the Docker client, create your token, and then once you have your unique token, pass it to all your nodes. So maybe just client-side commands like Docker cluster create, and just it gives you a token, and then you use join cluster everywhere.
Okay, so that could work. The only trick there is that I'm thinking about pluggable clustering backends, or rather, pluggable discovery backends, right? Since you're going to do Docker cluster create, that's going to use the backend in your client config, but then that means your daemon config has to be synced with that so that it goes and looks in the same place, right? So one way is we say, well, just figure it out, just have your config synced, and the default config is synced. The default is just, as long as you have the same version of Docker, the client and daemon will use the same discovery. Is that acceptable as an answer, or is it too complicated to say? Well, it means in practice, if a sysadmin deploys a specific custom, for example, a custom discovery service that uses that cluster, right, or a local zookeeper cluster, or maybe calls out to a shell script that triggers homemade DNS changes to the DNS zone, whatever it is, right? These are things that ops people will want to do, right? Is it okay to say, hey, if you want to create a new cluster from the Docker experience, you have to have the same configuration in the client, which, by the way, means now the client needs to have plugins too, right? And I know architecturally we're converging towards it's a runtime, and the fact of acting as a client or a daemon are just commands in that same runtime.
Yeah.
But today, that's not the case, right?
And if you're going to have like a custom discovery backend, like if you're doing your own shell scripting around DNS, you probably don't want to like create a plugin for the CLI just to create the cluster, since you're gonna have like 1 or 2 tops, and you're just gonna create your cluster and then just pass whatever information. But you probably don't want to like write an automation to create clusters. I mean,
Okay.
in my opinion, because you're just doing
Okay, so I'll just leave that as an open question.
that would be more useful for like partners creating actually like integration with other kind of discovery services, but not for like ops just creating their own. Because I mean, they really create the in some way.
It's really just for getting started. But okay, open question. So docker-g-join cluster and the ID, and it has to exist for me to use it.
Yes.
And I guess if we do have a default zeroconf backend, perhaps the answer is that in zeroconf, like you said, it's all you need is probably it'll just advertise it, and that's the end of the creation process, right?
Yeah.
So that might be the answer right there.
Yes. It might.
Okay.
It might.
So now master. How do I set up a master?
By the way, shouldn't the master part be first in the documentation, since that's why you should start first?
No, you should not start first. You can start it at last.
Yeah, or whatever.
There is no order, basically.
Oh, that's good to know. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea is that like eventually your master is gonna go down and bring back up, so it can be started and stopped at any point. I think it's more like whatever makes more sense for the documentation.
Yeah, it's right now. If you take the flow, for example, you can start 2 steps that will register themselves to the discovery. Then you start the master, so it will pick the IPs from your 2 slaves, and then afterwards you can start the third, and the master will pick it up automatically. So there is no order. You can start the way you want.
So does the master have a specific place in the list of nodes in the discovery, or is it just another node, or is it not a node? Is it not reachable?
So right now, so we're going into this into steps. Right now, the master is not a node. Like it can only be used to orchestrate, to scale containers. But it doesn't scale containers on its own, and you can only select a master manually. That's the way it is right now. Eventually, the goal would be to have like master election, so your master can, like any slave could become a master. In which case, it means that you will have to schedule containers like on. The master will basically schedule container on itself, because since it can go become master, you already have containers, so you just have to assume that containers will be running into that node. It's still a little fuzzy if like every slave can become master, or if you actually set up a pool of slaves that can become master, in which case you don't schedule containers on them, because like depending on size of cluster, doing like the housekeeping of the cluster will take like some amount of resources. So you probably don't want to run containers alongside the master. Right now it's really in the early stages. So yeah.
Right now it's a node.
I would say it's not
Sorry,
a node.
but isn't this like an implementation detail? Like some other plugins would not have necessarily the notion of selecting a master like this in the command line. It would like automatic master election or maybe another architecture.
I think just let's put a pin on that one. I think as soon as you insert the notion of pluggability, there's a new dimension to every topic.
Yeah.
So we need the first question we saw was, could we make this plugins? I think we all agree that yes, we want this to be ultra pluggable. But for now, let's go through like the out of the box functionality, and then we can do a second pass on how do we make this pluggable? Where do we insert an API, etc. So So I'll
Okay, no
let's
problem.
visit that once we talk about plugins, I guess is my point.
I agree on that. Like before doing plugins, we should have like a default implementation and
Yeah,
then figure out like what parts we want to plug.
Yeah.
Because right now it's easy to say everything is a plugin and be like meta.
Yeah.
Like clustering could be also I don't know SMTP server because you can just swap the backend or whatnot. So
Yeah.
like having a first implementation will really help to figure out like what people actually want to plug in. Depending like on the flow of the PRs, if people, hey,
Yeah.
by the way, use a PR to have like an alternative discovery service, and that might be like a good candidate to move as a plugin. But for the time being, we're not like.
I think that's good. That's acceptable. It's I think a big concern, the two big concerns that make this contribution interesting, right? First big concern is from the users saying, I use Docker, and I want Docker to be aware of multiple machines, and the easiest way for that to happen is through the Docker CL. When I look for Docker clustering, there's lots of ways to do it out there, but it's super fragmented, and I'm scared. So that's like that's the dominant user feedback. Then the secondary user feedback is, hey, I'm an expert at this or that clustering tool, right? And so I'm scared because now that I know that there is this discussion around adding clustering to Docker, I'm scared that my existing tool will no longer be supported. So please make it very pluggable so I can remove the default and put my favorite tool as a backend, right? So if I love Mesos, I should be able to put Mesos as a backend. If I love Kubernetes, I should be able to put Kubernetes as a backend, and so on for the other 20 tools at least, right? I mean, those two are the ones that are the most popular these days.
Yes.
But there are others, and there's also countless custom scheduling frameworks. I would say today for one out-of-the-box clustering system that's being used, there is 10 or 100 homemade ones.
Yes.
And yeah. So I think we have just to keep those two in mind. But also, I agree with what you said that the sequencing for the discussion is, good design means we need to agree on the default implementation first, but just know all along that we are pluggable. It's just that plugins for the sake of plugins, you just end up in a kind of a meta circle of death. And yeah, okay. So we know this, so we just keep it in mind, and we can keep going. So the thing with master, my impression is going back to UI.
Yes.
I tap -- master. I kind of expect the thing. I think Tibor has a point. I expect the thing that needs to run first that everyone else connects to, and it's almost more like a gateway or something. It's like it's the scheduler, right? Or it's the. I mean, it's. I think I don't know what the right word is, but I don't know. Have you thought about that?
Oh. Yeah, master felt actually good.
Because really, I mean, it's the master that it controls all the others, right? But what you're saying is there's a discovery service that needs to pre-exist, and then slaves join that. I mean, register themselves on that, and then a master kind of on the side it exists, and then uses discovery to find the address of nodes, and then controls those slaves, right? But my understanding is also, if I wanted to write a command line client, which actually, I mean, the master could be non-persistent, right? Could it? Could I have? I'm not saying we should, but just to make sure I understand the architecture. I could have a one-shot process that starts, joins queries the discovery service.
Yeah.
From there, collects the IP of all the slaves, and then does something, and then no. Because there is state. There is state to the master?
Yeah, there is state.
Okay. So maybe let's talk about that state.
Sure.
So the idea is I run this master, and then it listens. I'm just voicing my understanding so far. Just tell me if it listens using the same native Docker API, and it can talk to the master as if it were a regular host.
Yep.
But really, it's behind that API, it's been completely gutted, and instead of doing things like running Linux containers and actually allocating, moving directories around, it actually schedules these instructions to the slaves.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So follow up on last conversation we had, but when you
Yeah.
when I do Docker create and it creates a container, that container has an ID.
Yeah.
Is that ID the same ID as one of the actual containers somewhere in the slaves, or is it its own virtual ID?
It's gonna be its own version. So there's like there's the ID the master sees, and then there's the ID of the actual node. The reason is that ID might change. Like if you reschedule a container on a different machine, you get like a different host ID, but the virtual remain the same because that's the only like contract with the user. Like whenever you create a container, the only thing we'll give you back is an ID, not even the node, but just ID, and that's like our contract with the user. You can ask me this ID, and I will always tell you about it. So yeah, there's a mapping.
Okay.
So yes, we do have state. There's also state in the way like we want to store the requested, like the expected state, not the actual state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
Because the actual state can be built on the fly, while the requested state, that's something like sacred that we want to store because the user gave it to us once, and we have to ensure that if you ask us to run a container, well, we should like remember what you asked for.
I think it's very similar to a single node host. There's the config passed by the user of here's what I want. I want this container to exist. I want this container to be running or not running. And then the system, at the time you can change it synchronously, but really we already have to deal with situations where you restart the daemon and there's a bunch of processes still running. And so there is some state reconciliation, right? So I think everybody deals with that. I know there is I'm not going to go from there to the debate over is it better to represent actions in a cluster by writing a file which describes what you want or issuing commands to say do this, do that. I think that's a false debate because at the end of the day you're just you're changing desired state, and then under the hood there's always desired state and an actual state.
And actually it's more similar than you can actually think. So when you do like a Docker run, if you're like it feels like you're actually issuing just a run, but actually what run is doing is passing like a huge JSON blob to the server, and that's basically exactly like having a YAML file on the side because it gives the expected state, gives the container like the configuration, the host configuration, and other stuff. So it's just that you don't see it directly, but if you use the API, you're actually passing like a blob of JSON, giving the expected state of your container.
Yeah.
It's just that like behind the CLI, that's kind of hidden, but that's the way it works.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's kind of that discussion is not a discussion of what's the right or wrong architecture. It's a discussion of what's the user interface and design that feels right to me. So it's a design discussion. So it's a very subjective discussion. And so there's a dominant model in clustering tools, which is you write this big template that describes everything you want, and then you upload it, and then the tool does the diff. And it's the same thing we did at .cloud, right?
Yes,
the .cloud YAML describe your whole stack, and it's really cool, but it also has limitations. And when users want to do one-off changes, but basically it boils down to: do you offer the user an interface for making discrete changes to the current state? Like, hey, add this thing to the state, change this property of this part of the state, or do you focus on bulk upload of the new version of the state and then kind of resolve the diff from there? I think that's like if that's the only difference between the two models, we're down to design bike shedding, which I love, but everybody has their opinions. So anyway, yes. So there's internally, you guys are going to have desired state, and that's sacred, and it's what the user provided as input, and that's the stuff that must not be lost, right? And we should get into that. And then there is the actual state, which current Docker daemon collects from the underlying system. Your clustering modes master would collect from requests to other nodes, but at the end of the day, It's the same mechanism, right? So what about that state? Because in the case of single node, we just use local file system. We have our own problems with that. Like we're not super satisfied with the way we store state locally. There's a bunch of different systems. There's JSON files. There's a SQLite database. So we're in the process of kind of rethinking that. But far along are you in implementation decisions on that?
Very early, so if you could provide us with an API, we will be glad to use it.
Okay.
But for the time being, yeah, it's very early, so we're just storing state locally. Eventually, as we mentioned, we're gonna master election, so that local state is like it's not gonna be enough. So yeah, we have ideas on how to use Raft and synchronize it across the cluster, but for now it's really early stages. Like for the time being, we're really focusing on getting these category right, because that's at the end of the day, that's what clustering is. Like you could have all the nice features of having like master election, etc., or like discover and so on, but at the end of the day, what matters for the time being is getting like this category kind of right, because that's our main feature. So we have lots of work to do to figure out like a good way to store state, but I think it's a hot topic, generally speaking. Like there's no good way in Docker itself to store state.
Yeah.
Especially since like as soon as we add clustering, that problem gets amplified by the number of nodes.
Yeah. So that's another insertion point for the plugins discussion. And there's a separate discussion. And this weekend we did some experiments with Michael and Derek. I know Brian has been playing with his own kind of idea for plugins. I know Eric H has been playing with libpack as a way to store state. So all of this is kind of converging towards a unified way for Docker to call out to subsystems at the right time and pass to that subsystem an entry point to a common state layer, so that when we get to the, first of all, we can fix it and improve it in one place, and you don't have 5 subsystems each dealing with their own version of locking and currency and caching, etc. And then if that means when we address the problem of making that state distributed and dealing with availability, and etc., and maybe all the way to, are there different knobs? Operationally, do I want to have more control over the back, how that's stored under the hood? Then I think that's bigger than clustering, because everybody has that problem of state, and so you guys are just forcing us to address the possibility of a distributed state earlier, right?
Yes.
But another area where distributed state is also going to be needed. There's a mega thread about SDN and Docker, right? There's, I think, 5 warring factions now advocating different approaches to it, but the only thing everybody agrees on is the right way to do overlay networking across a bunch of Docker hosts is for the networking subsystem on each of the hosts to collaborate around, at the very least, addressing, and probably also endpoints for tunneling. And again, it boils down, the same problem as for you guys. If multicast were magically available everywhere, we would not have this problem, but it is not. So, anyway, a callback here for later on. A project-wide plugins and states solution. Okay. And maybe let's take a quick break and look at IRC. Okay. Bio break time. And we'll come back with a bunch of IRC questions. Oh, wow.
So if I was going to take a slow flow of information, but, we should at some point, be coming to some conclusions about things to go forward, like concrete things like, decisions on, decide this, like the one thing I heard, I guess, is that, the idea of, the solid idea of batteries included and then making things pluggable, and so my question is, right now for clustering, that might be like a good thing is to basically lock that down and like in the sense of like, you came up with the idea of, out of the box, you're going to have 2 things, you're going to have the zero conf option plus the hub option, but basically, kind of locking down that plan of like, here's our batteries included, idea. We're going to do this, and like and then getting buy-off on what batteries included means, and then moving on to plugins. I mean, do you want to? I mean, I'm searching for the way to kind of like concretize some actions like that would be like quote, deliverables that we could actually do that make sense. I mean, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I'm just asking.
Yeah, I think we should clarify here that the desired outcome is a default clustering backend and a pluggable way to insert other clustering backends. And whatever we have in code in V1 is what we'll have in code in V1, but we should already have the clear plan for V2, V3, etc. I personally would prefer if, as early as V1 of this thing, it was pluggable right off the bat.
Right.
I think we should aim for that. But if we're still like make it pluggable, we probably don't want clustering only plugins. My guess is that making clustering pluggable intersects with the larger problem of making Docker pluggable, which is a really big deal and to a lot of people beyond this particular feature. And so I think we should at least have a plan B for the scenario where clustering is ready. We have a really decent default implementation that can help a lot of people.
Right.
And plugins are not quite ready.
Exactly.
So what do we do? Right.
Exactly.
But Solomon, there's one problem with that, is that if we, for instance, ship a version of clustering that has some API, and then later on we realize that that API will not interface well with others, then we'll have like technical debt again.
You're totally right. Yeah, that's a good point. So I think it's we should make it a gateway. We should have a good answer in the design to pluggability, even if it's not fully.
Exactly. We don't necessarily need pluggability right away, but we need the interface to be there.
Yeah. And probably the answer is one hard part about plugins is, well, there's where to insert the hooks, and then there's what API to expose to the developer of a plugin, and then there's how do you distribute and install and run plugins separately from the Docker binary, right? And since Go doesn't have out-of-the-box dynamic objects, there's this whole kind of thread on allowing a process to be a plugin, or even a container to be a plugin, and using libchan for communication, etc. Blah blah blah. My point is that might not be ready when clustering is ready, because clustering seems to be moving pretty fast. So, but we should have point A, maybe point 1 and 2 figured out before, and maybe point 3 is more of an implementation detail.
Yeah, I just want to make sure the interface everybody agrees on. That's all.
Yeah, totally right. I agree. All right, let's 3 more minutes break, and then we'll be back.
Are you still using Influx?
No, it got too full and it was so slow. Do you think we should use it though?
Well, Graphite's like 3 containers. And
Yeah.
stuff.
Oh no,
Less
that's so
than
true.
1.
Yeah, maybe we should.
I think you were what were you storing in it?
All the
Like CPU.
the
Yeah, and OSC.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it got like, and then I was like,
I just don't think it can handle. But like with these stats, it's just like a couple data points instead of like.
Yeah, we only have
50.
like 4 or 5 tables. Like, yeah, that would be good.
Okay, we're back. So part 2 of Docker Tuesday. The topic is still clustering, and whatever I hope I had of covering more than one topic, I think at this point is out the window. By the way, we started late. Sorry about that. Usually we said 9. I think we're going to make it 9:30, so that we have a little time to prepare beforehand. So it's going to be 9:30 a.m. PST every Tuesday. So let's catch up on IRC. You will need state in the master. That is hard. We just pick etcd. So yeah, that's a good point. Joe and IRC saying having state in the master is hard. So I think we're in agreement there. And there's a question about just pick etcd. And I'm going to say my understanding of what you told me last time, because I asked the same thing. The answer was one of the reasons there's a lot of user requests for this is people get used to having Docker as their only dependency to get started. And again, the kind of the signature design is you drop this binary and then you can do something useful. And you specifically don't have a dependency on a piece of infrastructure that may or may not be there, right? At least when you get started. Then there should be pluggable backends to say, hey, I actually do have an etcd deployment over there. That's how I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
So that should be possible. It should simply not be required to get started. Right.
Correct.
So for that reason, it seems like you guys are going the route of embedding at least a default implementation of shared state.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the right call. Also, I think it's, yes, shared state and synchronization is hard, but we don't really need to solve it because, yes, there's etcd. There's also Go Raft, which is really the hard part of etcd.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of other implementations out there. So as hard as that stuff is, I think it's kind of like crypto. Like, it's hard, doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
You should just use someone else's lib that does it.
Solve,
right.
Again and again. So.
So I feel like right now we're every time we're sweeping a lot under the pluggability rug. So that it's going to be really important to talk about how exactly does this integrate into Docker. Is this a plugin in the first place? Does it have its own backends? But before we talk about that, let's finish going over IRC and seeing if there's questions there. Okay, so I'm scrolling up. So Proppy's suggesting using Twitch TV instead of YouTube. If it doesn't have this crazy lag, then I'm all for it. Sorry, people in RC asking questions. I know it's frustrating that you hear what we talk about after we've talked about it, but we're going to find a better tool. So Joe had a quick comment about, I think the breaking point for command line flags will come with more and more plugins. That's I guess a orthogonal point, but with plugins and more options, like I think Joe's talking about the problem of every time we add an area of functionality, as pluggable as we want to make it, if it means there's 5 to 10 new flags in the main binary, over time you have this kind of matrix of hell of flags that are just, there's a lot of them and they multiply each other in weird ways. So we should fix that. I have a specific idea to fix that, but let's not talk about it now. Maybe that'll be the topic of the next reviews design. So then there's a suggestion of Docker run -- JSON and a JSON spec, or Docker run -- YAML. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that.
Yeah, and I think it's that's maybe like one of the fun of that. It's not related to clustering.
Yeah.
Like it's
It's a UI.
single node.
Yeah.
Like
So
clustering.
because this is a big feature, by discussing it, we're uncovering various areas that it affects, but are bigger than the feature itself. So we should take note of them. One of them is plugins. The other one is explosion of more and more options in the UI. The third is security, etc.
Yep.
Auth. There's something about Cloud Foundry's Bosch. Oh yeah, that's another one. Uses something like CLI sessions. Oh, I see. So there's a kind of, I guess, a stateful client.
Oh.
Yeah, you load a state, and then the client knows about that state. Okay, so this is one of these orthogonal things. Let's not talk about that for now. Like whether we do this or not, it would affect clustering and everything else in Docker. Yeah. Okay. Another comment about really wanted to do actual versus desired state. Going through the comments. Anybody else catch a comment or question that we should talk about?
Everything should be in a container.
Is that you or is it RC?
No, it's not.
It's on IRC. It's Joe answering to Brian. Good point. Everything should be in a container. Right where your pointer is right now. Oh,
yeah. So oh, you mean where it was 60 seconds ago? Oh no, you're on the Hangout.
11:15 a.m.
Yeah. So that's plugins, right? The best way to achieve pluggability in Docker is probably to run third-party plugins in containers, because otherwise you end up reinventing everything that containers do, but with a second track with worse tooling and less people using it.
Maybe we should mention like the way we're doing development right now. Like the way we're envisioning this is we're not just adding like a bunch of code to Docker. We're actually like we're going with the same model as with containers. So the code is on the side. We offer an API, and that API is used by Docker. So it's not like we're basically messing around with the entire Docker code base. It's fully separate. And agreed, right now there's no plugin system, but as soon as there will be one, clustering instead of being just a library statically linked to Docker will be a plugin. So starting now, like an afterthought, but starting now, the code base for clustering is separate from the code base of Docker, and it's integrated. Well, we don't have a plugin API, so right now it's just statically linked. So that's like the kind of plugins that right now in Docker is just link a library and then do a bunch of ifs and just call the library. But
so two things. I guess we kind of have to address this question of plugins, and I think the best way to put it would be assuming that your backend and your default scheduler implementation basically is a plugin. What plugin API? So putting yourself in the shoes of the people developing the plugin, what do you need from the core?
So the plugin from the core, we would need a way to interact with the API, like the internal API, from adding like methods up to like replacing entirely the API endpoint. Because with clustering, we just need to basically hijack the entire API. We would need to be able to add like probably commands and a few options like to debug mode. So that's probably the main part.
So add new commands, not just hook into existing commands?
Probably add commands like, well, for instance, we talked about registering creating a cluster. I don't remember like what we agreed on, but if it's a new command, then we would need a way to like register the command.
But then you also need to hook into basically every single command, right?
Well, so my point was we would need a way to like hijack the API, so replace methods, and up to like replace the entire like API router of the.
Okay, so that was I was going to ask, because I know for your demo implementation, you did not patch the Docker binary. You re-implemented the same server API.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying is it would not be enough to use the existing remote API router and hook into the commands. You would need to actually replace the whole router.
It depends. If we have an API to hook into a command, we could like hook into every single one of those, which is the same as like replacing the entire router. But yeah, we would need a way to say like probably to interact with the API, like add this endpoint or like replace this existing endpoint. So when you do like container like PS, call my code instead of the default implementation, or replace the entire router. I mean, that's like an implementation detail, but we will need to be able to interact with every single existing API command and probably register more.
So is it per command? So there's one. I'll stay slightly more abstract in saying, regardless of how this is implemented, your high-level requirement is not necessarily to replace the HTTP router, but your requirement is for each command, you need to be able to hook into that command and replace its default implementation. So list containers, you need your own implementation. List images, run container, everything. Right, everything. And then on top of that, so that's requirement number 1. Requirement number 2, you also want to expose new commands.
Yes. We may. I'm assuming like we will, but yes.
And today, one command is just the -- join cluster flag, I guess.
Yes.
So that's different though, because that's not a dynamic command. It's a daemon flag, right?
Yeah.
Although connecting this to the UI discussion from the beginning, our problem of having hard-coded flags in your hard-coded daemon flags somewhere in an init script you can't easily change. What if joining a cluster, creating a cluster, those were dynamic commands issued to the daemon? Right? Like there's a daemon, and you talk to it, and you say, "Hey, join this cluster," and now it's joining the cluster. It's joined the cluster. You could also say, "Hey, now be the master for this cluster," right? That's
So
more in line.
that would be Docker cluster subcommand.
Sorry?
That would be like a Docker cluster subcommand.
Right? Yeah, you mean like that would actually be a client call to the remote API?
Well,
You
you could do it that way.
Mention that Andrea was talking about, where so far, if it's a subcommand, it goes through the client as an API call.
Yeah.
That's what you mean, Tibor, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So yes, that's what I mean. So the advantage with that is you don't you don't add extra flags, and you have more flexibility in when and how clusters are joined or created. So it becomes possible to say, here's a way to create a cluster. It also becomes possible, we talked about multi-tenancy earlier, you can at least imagine that a same Docker host joins multiple clusters, right?
I guess like probably the best way to go for us is, instead of telling you like what we're thinking, is probably just exposing our requirements. So for the subcommand, the idea is that yes, you could have like a subcommand and you just have it into the cluster, but the reality is that you will like have a bunch of machines and you will create new machines on the fly probably, and so you don't want to like go into the machine and say Docker join or Docker cluster join. You just want to have that like part of your boot up options, I guess, and be like your service just a simple boot to Docker, and you set that flag and just pops into your
I think
provider. And
I agree, but I think those are not mutually exclusive, right? I think my point is we were talking about pluggability, and I think, and then we're saying, okay, you need to hook into API commands, and then you need to do this completely different things, which is hook into flags, right? So that means you need a plugin to have like a add flag thing and like hook dynamic command thing. And to Joe's point, I agree that if we can avoid API flag, daemon flag sprawl, that's a good thing. Especially if you're talking about plugins, Plus, if you're talking about dynamic plugins, I don't know. It feels cleaner to me to have plugins that hook into handlers of the remote API than to have plugins just add random flags to the top level daemon, right? But if we say, actually, the general architecture, and this is true, is that when there is a flag in the daemon, to do something like run in daemon mode, right? -d. That's actually a convenience wrapper around what is really triggering a job, right? And today, the real the command-oriented layer of Docker is you run jobs, and then when you call the remote API, that's just an HTTP wrapper to calling jobs, right? So maybe the answer is the fundamental insertion point of a plugin is at the job level, and as a plugin, you can hook into this or that job, right? And then
I totally agree with what
those jobs can be triggered through a daemon flag, and most of them or all of them can be triggered through the remote API, but maybe down the road there is a separate admin API or something. But at the end of the day, and you know, there was a discussion just a few days ago about how cool it would be to have an SSH endpoint into Docker, so that instead of having this horrible hack in the REST API with hijacking TCP to do attach, we could just rely on the SSH protocol. If we do that under the hood, it would still be jobs, right? So that would be the bottleneck for inserting a plugin.
Should we have we like to switch to, well, it's not related, but we like to switch to WebSockets for. So there's already an implementation in Docker itself, but we are currently having problems with that, like how we hack. So it's hard to attach from like the cluster master to the node using the API we have, because it's fairly complicated to do. Anyway,
yeah,
not related.
So that, I mean, that would be a benefit, right? If you can piggyback on the actual implementation of remote API and then rely on jobs, and then jobs have improvements. I mean, jobs could use some improvements, is what I meant.
Yeah.
And we know that. And I think the model, the command-oriented model with added benefits like streaming, possibly nesting, easy pipelining. So that, for example, multiple plugins could hook into this register on the same command, right? That's stuff that's not possible with today's job implementation. But the jobs implementation spawned the work on libchan, and now libchan is ready to be used for things like pipelining and streaming. And so, bring into the picture, I think you have like a jobs. Think of it as jobs v2, leveraging libchan. And that's exactly what Brian did in his proof of concept not long ago. Then you have, I think that, I would say, let's try and see how far we can go in using only that for a plugin. And then you guys can tell me, okay, we're missing something. And then we can talk about how to add it.
Okay. Yeah.
So how do we make that happen in code? Do you want to... One way is you guys actually, you decide, okay, we're going to contribute this as the first plugin, and then along the way we're going to do a rudimentary basic plugin system just for us, and then they'll force maintainers to address the issue of plugins and improve it, but we have the bare minimum for us. Another option is that's too much work for just the two of you, so we make it kind of a hack session.
Yeah, actually I'm not really afraid of too much work. I'm afraid of actually designing the plugin system with our use case in mind. It will be really biased to whatever we're doing, because we're not designing for. Well, we're trying to design for everyone, but really we design with our only use case in mind.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm not saying
it will not be the best possible design on there if we do it ourselves, because it's.
I agree.
It's cheating, like doing the plugin and the plugin API at the same time, because.
I agree, and I'm not saying please contribute to plugin system, but I think your attempt at approximating plugins for your use case will actually be the most informative thing you can give us on what you need. Better than a document, I think, because trying to make it pluggable, you'll hit problems. And sure, you won't hit every problem that other plugin creators will hit, but hooking into existing commands is pretty standard stuff, right?
I mean, I agree with you, Salman. I think if Victor and Andrea could get like an interface written down, I'm sure other people, Brian and others, and probably me as well, we would hack on providing that interface to them.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's option one, where we stand by to provide the core side implementation, but following the queue of the interface you need, and then that starts a conversation about a plugin interface. And yes, it won't be perfect, but it'll be a starting point. It'll be much better for core maintainers than the current situation, which is it's on us to kind of come up with to wear both hats, right?
Yep.
So let's give that a try. All right.
Yeah, we can.
Let's figure out the amount of work. And
okay. So for amount of work, the key thing is pluggability in general and having like a plugin API. That's probably the most important thing on the project side that we want to contribute. So if it means, if you say, well, we could do something really awesome and then make it a plugin and have pluggability in V1 instead of V2, but we need help from 2 maintainers, then we can make it happen, because this will benefit everybody. You know, and it'll make my life easier because I'll have less frustrated people. Oh, you guys can't see, but Michael just raised his hand, so he's volunteering.
He's
Okay. No, I mean, let's do a Docker dev and take it from there.
Yeah.
Okay. We got 15 minutes left. Questions? Or what do you, okay, so the priority here is we're contributing review so that you guys can go back and do another cycle of your proposals. So what if we end now, what's the first thing you will be stuck on waiting for us? And let's deal with that. UI decisions?
I think for the master part, we didn't agree on flags and stuff. We just stopped the discussion.
UI for master.
Like, do we keep dash master and join cluster, or do we merge the two and just use, I don't know.
How about, since we have join cluster?
Dash manage cluster.
Yes. See, we feel the same thing. That means intuitive. Or I kept them off before.
No.
Dash join cluster, and then dash control cluster or manage cluster, right?
The thing to know is that eventually, like, the master file should go away.
Well, we just made it go away.
No, but I mean, the idea would be
only
everybody join. And there are elections. So
that's why right now it's a separate flag, because the idea is that eventually
you can deprecate it.
So that you're saying everybody would join and would be both slave and master?
There would be an election.
One master will be elected around the slave.
But as a client, how do I follow? How do I know who to connect to?
So that's the still not entirely decided, but it is that since, like, they all agree, they all do an election, so that everyone knows who's the master because of the election flag. So the idea is that you could talk to any node in the cluster, and if they're not the master, they just forward your command
forward
to the master. Yeah. The idea is that just pick any node and you can scale container.
So you kind of, in exchange for an extra network hop, you get like much more, operational ease.
Yeah.
There's also more moving parts, right? Like different clients may be talking through to the master through different routes, and so if something goes wrong, the first thing is, is it wrong with the master or the hop?
Yeah. That's why we haven't decided yet, because it's really great, but it has like its downsides. And also, it's not really entirely sure yet if you want every node in your cluster to become master. So like if you have 100, you don't want like 100 possible masters. You probably only want a small pool. Since the master itself may take resources, so maybe you want dedicated machines to that. So we just threw the idea in there of just saying you could talk to any node. It's super easy, just forward to the master because they know. It's very similar to what MongoDB does. If you can talk to any node, and if it's part of a replica set in some master, will reply you, hey, by the way, here's the master, so go away, I won't reply to you.
One question I have is, if we want multi-tenants, if we down the road we want more elaborate scenarios where there may be multiple clusters involved across the same pool of machines, you know what I mean? So different clusters may have different sets of machines. Different machines may be part of different clusters, right? Yeah. Which, I think it seems like overkill, but I think operationally, I think it's very useful, especially since you can only run one Docker host per machine.
Is that? Yeah. And there are two ways of doing that. One is to basically have the support built into clustering, to say, okay, here's a machine and I want to logically play two subparts.
Yeah.
Or the second option would be to make, that's like a bigger project, to make Docker.
Yeah, so I'm not saying we should do that now. I'm just saying I'm thinking about ways to keep the implementation future-proof so that it's possible. Yeah. And one aspect of that is when you make assumptions about, how to connect to the master and what what you're going to be doing when you talk to a particular endpoint.
Yeah.
If you have that situation of multi-tenancy, how do you know? Like, what happens if I want to run two schedulers? For example, two different schedulers for the same pool of machines, something like that, right?
Yeah.
So if the IP port at which I can connect, that's a single value for a given host. You know what I mean? Like, wait, I'm not expressing myself clearly, but
I see what you mean. Like there might be more than one master, right? So it's hard to proxy that to a single master since there are multiple. So
and there might be like segment logical groups of masters where for the same cluster, for the same pool of slaves or flapping pools of slaves, depending on who you are, what authorizations you have, or if you're production or staging, you're talking to a different set of masters.
As I said, like it was simply a random idea. Another idea we had would be, so you have that token in the for the discovery. An alternative would be Docker when you use the client instead of passing -h the IP address, you just pass that discovery URL and automatically it finds the master, so you can set that as your Docker post environment variable, and in a way or another finds the master. But right now we decided to postpone the issue by just saying single master. And back to the original issue was, do we want to have a managed cluster versus joint cluster flag, or keep it joint cluster and have a separate master flag? And the reason we went into all those discussions.
That's if you make the assumption that in the end it'll only be joint cluster.
Yeah, maybe it will be.
But I think that assumption, whether it's true or not, I think it doesn't change anything if you rename master to just -- manage cluster. Either way, you end up potentially deprecating a flag later.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what that flag is called, right?
Yeah.
Isn't
just before it was just a bool, so we would just skip the master and it would continue to work. Here we would have to, I don't know, basically rename the manage to join. I don't know. It's kind of different from.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it looks like you guys have not really made up your mind on how you want that to work. The discussion is not finished, so I would say for now let's focus on usability of V1.
Okay.
What were you, I don't know where you're going to say.
Just one quick question, but regarding usability, isn't already the notion of a slave strongly dependent on the implementation? And if we want to be able to swap it out later, are we really sure that this is really some common?
It kind of makes sense to assume that.
Yeah, there's always going to be the concept of a program running somewhere, which basically maintains, controls a deployment of virtual containers, and it does that by making calls to underlying.
Okay.
So that program is always going to need to run somewhere, right? So the question is, will it run?
The concept of master is universal.
I think so, yeah.
So we made some decisions that, for instance, we agreed we don't want to be the multi-master business. So we don't want because the alternative would be every node in your cluster is a master, and then you have some synchronization, locking, and so on. And that is so complicated to implement and results in lock contention all the time that we decided, okay, we're not doing multi-master, we're just gonna have a master-slave system, and that's one of the basic principles around clustering. And we read that we're not gonna change it. It's if you look around at every clustering or scaling project, multi-master because that currently really hard. And so there will be only a single master, and so that's why it's.
But the state, so everyone's focusing on preserving the integrity of the state across multiple nodes, and then if in a worst case scenario you lose, for a loss of nodes or a network partition, you temporarily lose the ability to schedule new containers, but the state is not lost.
Yeah.
That's a good outcome.
Yes. Yeah. So we want to be basically we want just to be consistent and tolerant to partitions.
I have a question. that cluster that I joined with the ID.
Mhm.
That is attached to, that is basically, behind that there is nodes and IPs just for the function of getting started and reaching other nodes. And then I leave that discovery service completely behind, and now I'm talking to nodes. Nodes are talking to each other directly, and then they share, and then separately, the master has state. So on the one hand, you have the I guess my question is, will the state be stored in this using the same mechanism as the discovery information, or are these two completely unrelated things?
Well, it really depends on the discovery implementation. It could very well be much.
For the hub, it
Yeah.
won't be. It won't be. We don't want
Yeah,
to store.
for the
we don't
hub,
want
yeah,
to store
definitely
the.
not for the hub. I'm thinking we're referring if we have like a non-centralized, like non-hub discovery system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get, the reason I'm asking is we're using the cluster ID as the entry point for access to the nodes, to the slaves. Is there an equivalent entry point to the state of a master? Okay, no. So, well, I'm looking at the UI for the master, right? So let's say it's manage. Docker-g-manage cluster in the ID. So it uses available discovery methods to bootstrap a list of slave nodes, and it uses that as its backend. And then that master separately creates or rejoins, if it exists already, master state. Right? We were just saying that master state will need to be shared. So, and at least in the default implementation, it will be shared using a mechanism that is bundled with the schedule, with the master, right? So let's say like a raft implementation, but we also want that to be pluggable so that you should be able to configure a master to not use a bundled raft and instead call out to an existing etcd or zookeeper cluster, right? So my question is, are these two pools of states, right? The cluster and the available nodes, available slave nodes, and then state of the master. So in a way, actual states on one side and desired state on the other. Are they should we just say, well, these are two completely different things? You can configure them completely separately, or should they be part of a single overall kind of find your state somewhere configuration?
Okay. Good question. It's hard to say right now because like sharing. So only the discovery is much more simple than actually sharing the state. So for instance, we mentioned zero conf, and like it's good to do discovery, but you can't save for that. So what I'm saying is it could be, but it limits the options of the discovery because
yeah, like you might want your local etcd for master states, but still rely on the hub or zeroconf for initial discovery.
Yeah, and for instance, you probably don't want to store your central state into the hub because so the way it's thought is that if the hub goes down, it's not reachable. All that will happen is that simply you want to join new nodes to the cluster, but the cluster will continue running. If you start to store like the central state into the hub, means that if the hub is not reachable or if you have like networking issues, then your cluster is dead. Like you cannot do anything with your cluster.
So whereas if it's separate, it's only discovery in the hub. Then if the hub is dead, you cannot
add new
nodes.
Yeah, that's it. So it stays available. It's limited availability, but it continues to function like there's no.
Yeah.
So we have.
The other thing is discovery could be stacked, right? Like you could have multiple sources of discovery, and they could be sharded or kind of loosely overlapping. And the hub is down, you could try a fallback. Whereas you need the master state needs to be in one and only one place.
Or you could statically configure it if you want. Just like give a list of it or whatever. But point was that,
Okay, so
I
what is
think
the
those are two different things.
Okay.
Okay, so we're just about. Should we do kind of a high level, just a high level recap of like what we got out of the session and going forward? So I could start with the things from my notes. Just the three top things. We're basically once again the idea of batteries included, just getting started with Docker as a default. Having a way to basically do initial service discovery and get up and get going without relying on anything else.
Yeah.
And then the next thing, of course, is the plugins. I think also the most significant thing I think was that we basically put some stakes in the ground of like, even though it's not perfect, just try to get going on and you say a biased implementation, but just declare up front that it's that, and just take it with the idea of like, we're going to try to find the things that we run into, and just the process of doing that, you're going to uncover a lot of great ways to go forward and highlight the problems. But just to get going on that, because as Tibor I think said, if we start out with a implementation that doesn't have some plugin architecture going, it's going to be really, really difficult going forward after that. So a lot of technical debt. And then we sort of tabled the security auth thing, because I think that for lack of a better way of saying it, the ecosystem is going to handle that somehow with our trust, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So those were my three things. I don't know, do you guys, that's just from my perspective, but do you guys have other?
The three
Okay.
topics we covered.
Yeah, we also made specific changes to UI.
Yeah.
Which
Those-
were?
Well, we changed the flags, moved the flags
those
around
are like
basically.
written to the updated proposal, right?
I did. Oh, I mean, I typed the notes. Like,
Yeah.
haven't
Yeah,
yet.
I mean, like those are recorded.
Yeah.
Just to make sure
They're
that we
recorded.
walk out of the
Yeah.
with that state. Okay.
So the specific changes to the UI, they were flags. Which
Just like UI, like cosmetics. Well, not cosmetics.
Changing the flags that you use. I mean, it sounds silly,
yeah.
but also talking about the assumptions behind those flags.
Yeah. What it means to use.
Uh,
the analogy to hosts, I mean, or
Like instead of
To
being
discover
Just rename the flags.
it's
okay,
like
got it.
join cluster and manage cluster.
Okay,
things
got
like that.
and also, like, remove the notion of a URL. Like, don't explicitly
Just
give a
the
discovery
kind of-
URL. You give that's a back-end consideration. Yeah.
Okay.
And then we agreed that you guys would try and work on the implementation as a poor man's plugin, and along the way define the interface that you want. With and we agreed on a starting point, which is let's try to do it at the job layer, right? Overriding jobs, and then
Maybe
we're standing by to fix what's broken or give feedback on the interface and help with implementation.
I don't know if we mentioned that, but probably what we want to do is have a pluggable design, but not like go for way plugins. I mean,
Say again?
Probably what we want to do is have a pluggable design. So
Pluggable design for clustering.
yeah, but
Okay.
not actually the entire plugin implementation, like loading the actual plugin, doing the communication, and etc. Well, yes, but not
You're
by us.
saying
we'll take someone from.
You're saying that you're okay with making your contribution
wherever we add
as
value.
pluggable as possible, and
Yeah.
along the way sketch out the outline of that pluggability,
Yeah.
but not take responsibility for a full-blown plugin system.
Yeah, well, so-
Of course, yeah, totally agree.
I mean,
The goal is not for you
whatever
to-
we add value to. So
Yeah.
For that thing, like for the way we actually do the plugins, that's where we add value because we have this plugin to do.
Yeah.
But actually, the plugin system, loading plugins on with like us or someone else is gonna be the same. So it
Yeah.
will be someone
Basically, if we say, the way to put it is, if we agree to make it a requirement for merging this feature that it is a plugin, then you taking into account this arbitrary constraint should just optimize for getting your thing merged. And since we're saying, well, we'll only merge it as a plugin, then probably what you want to do is push for those damn plugins to be even available. and of course you won't be alone because everyone else wants plugins, but at least you are now incentivized to push in that direction.
Because we're going to merge clustering as a plugin. you're saying.
Well, we're saying we won't. Tentatively, we're saying we think it's better to only merge it if it's a plugin.
Okay, got it.
even if it means, even if plugins are only statically compiled in for now, you know,
Yeah.
but it's still a major step forward.
Okay.
And maybe if next time you can come back with at least an outline of what it looks
Yeah,
like
yeah.
to have, let's say, Mesos, Bosch, or Kubernetes as a backend. Like, what does that look like? Like, it just in an outline. Because we keep saying that, but in practice, you know, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Yep. Another point I kind of liked, and then we have to go, but I think Mesos has a framework API.
Yep.
If there's APIs out there that it makes sense to support, you know, especially if there's an existing ecosystem around it, then, you know, our goal is not to fragment. If there's an API that's widely adopted that does exactly what we need, I think right now everything is deeply fragmented, but, you know, Mesos framework strike me as maybe one thing that has enough traction to be worth looking at least as an API. I don't know. And plus, I think Kubernetes is available as a Mesos framework, and so is Marathon and Kronos. So, yeah.
Yeah, we should take a look.
So the pro is you get a lot of available backends without extra effort. The con is, you know, if it doesn't fit, then it doesn't fit. Okay.
Cool.
Any other questions? No.
Cool.
So based on all the feedback we gave, you guys are in favor of potentially merging this if they implement what we asked? Still think it's a good feature?
Yeah.
Just like reality check, if it's suitably pluggable, do we still feel like it's within the scope of Docker?
Yes.
Well, it's your patch. You don't get to say. I think so. I think Darren, I build a cloud, put it pretty nicely. Just, you know, it's the only reason to use Docker is if you're building applications across more than one machine.
Yeah.
And if Docker has zero concept of that at all, sure you can wrap it, but that's a stopgap. It's not the optimal solution. So let's just like really avoid the kind of monolithic all things to all people approach, right? That's not what Docker is about. So, okay.
Great. Thank
Cool.
You very much.
Thanks to whoever is listening, if anybody is. If anybody's out there, thanks for listening. We'll try Twitch next time.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, wait, how do I turn this thing off?
So you